Good afternoon, everyone. Let's get started. My name is John Donvan. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll get out of the way very quickly that this is not a prop. I suffered an injury that required surgery, and it's getting better. Ben Rosen, when I told him about this in early July, immediately gave me the out saying, you don't have to come. I'll cover for you, we'll get somebody else. And of course I said absolutely no way, because I love being here and it's a pleasure, and I figured I could figure out a way to do it, and I was right. We're entering into a topic related to within the sphere of education, and as a journalist and also as somebody who moderates debates on a wide variety of topics, I've noticed that there are a few topic arenas that impact all of us, in which the level of passion that people have becomes extraordinarily and almost inexplicably high. One of them relates to food. Whenever we debate things related to food or agriculture, people can get crazy mad at each other depending on where they come down on one side of the issue or the other. FDA regulation, or GMO foods, or the government health suggestions. People can get very angry about that. Or health in general is another one. But the one I've really noticed that divides people in a very visceral, passionate way is education. And I've thought about why that is and why so many issues crisscross education and become very, very tough and visceral debates. If you think about it, from debates over evolution being taught in the schools, sex being taught in the schools, Title IX, teachers' unions, all sorts of pedagogical issues. That education is one that really, really gets people's danders up. And one of those issues that has done that, and that we're going to discuss now, is the question of charter schools. The first charter school only went into existence in 1992. It was started in St. Paul, Minnesota. It was founded actually by a group of public school teachers who were frustrated that they couldn't make the kinds of changes that they wanted for the kids that they were teaching. And there was a discussion going on in the state in which legislation authorized for the first time the use of public funds to teach schools under a charter, the notion of a charter being that people who had an idea for a school, set of principles for a school, a plan for how to run it, would make an approach to an authority that could pass or not pass, and they would basically say, we would like taxpayers to pay for the school that we've designed, and we're going to run it our way with some oversight from you, or not. And from that first school back in 1992, we're now at a point where there are 7,000, at least, charter schools across the country. They were started initially with enormous hope and inspiration. The main idea that they would be laboratories for innovation, the main idea being that they would allow, not just for experimentation to see what worked best, but also that they would provide an opening for people who were in what are often called the failing public schools, students in failing public schools, to have a shot at a better quality of education. So there was a great deal of hope put into them. But since their founding, almost actually from before the time they were first founded, there has been enormous controversy. Basically the question of taking public funds and removing them from the control of public boards of education, which are elected democratic bodies that oversee these things. So you can see where the seeds were sown for there being a lot of controversy over the question of charter schools. That's what we're going to discuss. And we're going to do it in a way today that I would say is more challenging to the narrative that charter schools are the solution and are working than we would have heard normally in the past. And then partially that has to do with the makeup of our panel. I'll get to that in just a moment. But before we start, I just wanted to ask, does anybody have any direct experience of charter schools in the room, either as a teacher or as a student? So I see a lot. Anybody who was actually a student who went through a charter school? No. Okay, so a number of hands went up to answer to the first question. So it shows that you've got a stake in this and some skin in the game, so I'll be very interested to see when the question time comes. But the first person I want to introduce to speak, and both of our speakers are going to speak for 5 to 10 to 12 minutes, something in that range. Carol Burris. Carol Burris is somebody I know from the Intelligence Squared series who debated with us very successfully on a different issue. But she is well known to have a strong and critical stance towards charter schools. She writes about these things in her blog for the Washington Post. most. She has firsthand experience in the classroom and in school administration as a high school principal of a school out in Long Island. She's part of your introduction always says that you are a high school teacher of the year in New York State. So high school principal of the year in New York State. So you were high school principal of the year in New York State. Is that every year? Or that was one time?
That was one time.
Okay, all right. Okay. So I think you get to use that over and over again. So congratulations. So I want to give the floor to Carol Burris, who's going to take a very, very skeptical look at the notion of charter schools.
Okay. Thank you. You did my first slide for me, John.
Okay.
It's true. It was in 1992 that a group of 3 teachers got together to form a charter school with the blessing and support of their district to work with a particularly at-risk group of students. However, 25 years fast forward, and charter schools are very, very different from what early proponents intended when they first envisioned schools like the school called City Academy, which is still in Minnesota. Now we find charter schools in shopping malls that kids are obliged to attend only 2 hours a week. Sometimes charters open and close in the same building, with the building's owner making exorbitant profits from rent. There are online for-profit charter schools that provide financial incentives for students to enroll. And charter schools are now advertised on billboards, buses, and even in movie theaters. The truth of the matter is, charter schools have become a parallel school system that's privately run, that competes with public schools for public tax dollars and students. After Doug presents, we'll talk about results, but what I'd like to focus on now with you are the consequences of charter school expansion on public schools and their students, on taxpayers, and on our democracy itself. As John mentioned, there are over 7,000 charter schools now, and this slide gives you a good indication of where we are today. Charters cost the state of California alone over $9 billion. In 33 states, for-profit management companies are allowed to run charter schools. Online charters that have awful learning results are regularly in trouble in the news for cooking the books with attendance. Yet they enroll nearly 250,000 students. Over 1/3 of all charter schools close after 10 years. So let's talk a little bit first about money. There are 3 primary ways that charters have negative fiscal effects on public education and on taxpayers, and I'm going to speak for just a few moments about each. The first is what's called stranded costs. Those are the costs that are incurred by districts when kids leave with tax dollars for charter schools. I like to explain stranded costs like this. When you send your kids off to college, you're paying for room and board, sometimes maybe as much as $20,000. But you don't save $20,000 to offset the costs over the 8.5 months that they're at school, because you still have to pay the mortgage, you have to heat the house, you have to pay insurance, and you have to turn on the lights. Well, the same thing happens with public schools. Having 5 students, 10 students, or even 100 students leave does not offset the costs that are left behind. And that has 2 consequences. Either taxes go up or programs are shut, band programs, sports, and services that are not required. In fact, it's gotten so bad that the Southern Poverty Law Center is now suing the state of Mississippi regarding the diversion of funds from public schools to charters. And then the second concern, fraud and mismanagement. For about the past year, we at the Network for Public Education have been keeping track of charter scandals on our website and Facebook page. It's, I think, an important service for us to provide because most of these stories appear in local newspapers, so the cumulative effect is not seen. Problems occur even in states with what are considered to have good safeguards. The National Alliance of Poor Charter Schools gives Ohio a perfect score for authorizer accountability. Yet some of the biggest scandals have happened in that state. One that is in the news now involves ECOT, the Electronic Classroom of Tomorrow. It collected nearly $1 billion from taxpayers. It's an online charter school. It was caught falsifying student records, and the state is now attempting to claw back $80 million. Now, shutting this school down has been a multi-year battle. That's because ECOT's founders and executives gave more than $1.2 million to state Republican campaigns. Unfortunately, what's starting to happen with the enormous spread of charter schools is that fraud and mismanagement are no longer rare bugs. They're almost becoming features of the system. And then there's the conflicts of interest and the sweetheart deals. Charter schools in some way are the perfect business model. Andre Agassi is now in charter schools. Pitbull is in charter schools. Founders and boards make no financial investments. The taxpayers give them the startup money and money for every customer that walks through the door. If the charter folds, people may lose their jobs, but nothing more. Half of the states do not insist in their laws that the property and assets go back to the taxpayers if the schools fail. The majority of states allow for-profit companies to manage the schools. In 14 states, vendors and charter officials can have conflicts of interest and are not even obliged to reveal them. Where the big money happens is in real estate. This is just one example of a few of the things that happen. The chain is called the Imagine Charter Schools, and I'm not imagining them, they really are called the Imagine Charter School chain. They have 55 schools in 8 states. Imagine Schools, the nonprofit, has a relationship with Schoolhouse Finance, a for-profit company, which in turn is connected to Entertainment Properties, which is a real estate investment trust. This is the way it works. Schoolhouse Finance buys the building. It then sells it to Entertainment Properties, which leases the building back to Schoolhouse Finance. Schoolhouse Finance then rents the buildings to Imagine Charter Schools, with some of their charter schools paying up to 40% in their taxpayer revenues for rent. Concerns about charter schools, however, go well beyond financial matters. There are increasing concerns about the erosion of democracy and limitations on students' civil rights. Public governance of schools in communities of color in our cities is disappearing. As one New Orleans mother once told me, "What is the point of choice if I have no voice?" There are entire neighborhoods in Chicago, for example, where there are no public schools anymore. In a recent PBS special on gun violence in Chicago, Professor Lance Williams of Northeastern University explained the damage done by charters to Chicago neighborhoods. He said, and I quote, "The most damaging of those policies was the policy of Renaissance 2010, that was started by Arne Duncan, when Chicago basically privatized through charter schools, neighborhood public elementary and high schools. It became a serious problem because many of the high schools and communities that had long traditions of street organizations caused young African American males to be afraid to leave their communities for new schools throughout the city of Chicago. So what happened, according to the professor, was they stayed home, they dropped out, and they got involved in violence. Of equal concern are the erosion of civil rights and the effects of sort and select policies. The evidence is clear and consistent. There are more suspensions and expulsions in charter schools, especially in what's known as the no excuses schools, and the rights of due process and appeal for students are limited. Many no excuses charters operate on what I call a tournament model. You join in the beginning, and you can be nudged out or leave, but a new student cannot enter to take your place. It's called having a no backfill policy. Success Academy charter schools are notorious for attrition without filling seats, but they are not alone. Of a cohort of 85 students who began the 8th grade in Basis Charter in Flagstaff, Arizona, only 35 students remained to enter 12th grade. In Basis Tucson North, a 7th grade class of 130 became a class of 54 by senior year. Nationally, we know that charter schools are exacerbating segregation. Let me give you another example from Basis. Only 3% of all students are Asian American in the state of Arizona. At Basis, however, the proportion is 32%. There are no Black students, and Latino students are severely underrepresented. Now, how does it happen? Well, there's no free lunch program, no free transportation, and parents are expected to make a yearly donation. Success Academy right now is being sued by 5 parents whose children with disabilities were pushed out. The Wonderland Charter School in Pennsylvania is presently being shut down after being caught blatantly violating the rights of students with disabilities. So where do we go from here? I don't know anybody who advocates just shutting down all of these charter schools that kids are dependent upon. But certainly we have to start to address some of the problems. The Network for Public Education, in conjunction with the Schott Foundation, recently issued a state-by-state report card on school privatization, with charter schools being a big part. And we had 2 major recommendations when it comes to charter schools. First, we support the NAACP moratorium on charter schools. We need to invest in our public schools and make them better. And we need to start to fix these big problems before we continue to let them expand. And the second is that we think that the solution is the one that's taken by states like Virginia, where charter schools are actually a part of the district public school system to be governed by those elected by the community. Thank you very much.
Douglas Harris is one of the world's leading researchers on charter schools, not just their history, but also their functioning, their operation, their success rates. And he also does it from a very, very interesting geographical perspective, based at Tulane University in the middle of New Orleans. New Orleans had, as we all know, a catastrophic flood in 2005, after which literally the old system was washed away. As people began to return to the community and new people began to enter the community, New Orleans started a move towards charter schools that has been unprecedented in the country, to the point, Douglas, where there are, all of the public schools in New Orleans are now charter schools?
There are a few that are not yet, but they're almost there.
Basically, it's an extraordinary experiment in how an entire city goes all charter school, or nearly all charter schools. So please welcome, with a different view take on this that I think, Douglas, you said you would call more nuanced. Ladies and gentlemen, Douglas Harris.
Thanks, John, and thanks, Carol. So yeah, I'm going to go at this a little bit differently, more of a pros and cons approach, and kind of let all you decide where this all lands. But I want to start off with a little exercise, if I can. So I want to describe to you 3 actual schools, and I want you to try to think about which one you think is the charter school. So School A is a school that has a really tight-knit community of families, and has a really strong reputation for special ed students. School B has strict discipline, very data-driven, very focused on test scores. And School C has a focus on creativity and really values the diversity of its population in terms of race and income. So how many of you would say School A sounds like a charter school? A few. School B? School C? Oh, interesting. Okay, that's not what I expected. I'm going to give you the answer at the end, but the reason I'm framing the question this way and starting off with that exercise, because I think it's really important to have this debate about charter schools, but really any debate about schooling in terms of what's actually happening in the schools, right? So what do children experience in the school, right? So I'm talking about, they're having a close-knit community, and what are the schools doing? And I think that's ultimately the most important thing here, and I think sometimes the debate gets too far detached from the schools themselves and what's happening in them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about New Orleans. I'm going to start talking a little bit about the national evidence first. So Carol gave you some of the arguments against charter schools. I'll give you some of the arguments for them. And this is based on both the arguments that are made sort of hypothetically, but also based on the evidence. So I think the first is that they provide a greater variety of schooling options. So just more types of schools that children and their families can choose from. Second is they produce slightly higher academic achievement when we look at standardized test scores. So math and reading scores are a little bit higher when we look at charter schools nationally versus the best comparison traditional public schools. And the third is almost a moral argument about freedom, and this is where the libertarians tend to come at this topic, that families should be able to choose. Regardless of anything else, they should be able to choose. And in particular, they should be able to choose when their traditional public schools are failing. They should be able to leave. So I think those are the three strongest arguments in favor of charter schools. The arguments against, Carol's already laid out, and the formatting of the slide got messed up, so I'm just going to skip past the arguments against, since you've really already heard that. But this does reflect the way I'm approaching this. I don't have a strong opinion, but there are arguments on both sides of this. All right, so let's talk about New Orleans. So New Orleans is very different from the nation as a whole, right? So the charter school movement nationally is all over the map. So when you hear a charter school is this or a charter school is that, really there are no two that are alike. And the states have different policies. The charter schools are all very different from each other. But New Orleans is different on so many levels. So John mentioned that it's almost an all charter environment, but it's even more than that. So after Katrina, the state took over almost all the schools, turned them almost all into charter schools, eliminated attendance zones, so there are no neighborhood zones effectively anymore. They got rid of the union contract, they got rid of tenure. Nothing's ever been done like this. In fact, any one of those things would have been a first, but New Orleans did all of those things at the same time. I'm only going to talk about the effects of the reforms. I'm not going to talk about the process, because there's a lot of very legitimate criticism of the process through which this occurred, because the city had basically been emptied out, and there was no way to have a debate and to have the community involved in this discussion. The state just took it over. There was not a lot of community involvement in this. So right now I'm just going to focus on what the effect was on children. All right, so there are a couple of plausible patterns here. This is kind of a funky graph. Let me just explain it. So I'm going to show you a whole bunch of series of results for New Orleans just to give you the general picture. On the left side of that, you see is the time period before Katrina, and you see that flat line there in the middle. So if you see a flat line there in the middle, it just means New Orleans and other districts nearby were going at about the same pace beforehand. There was no change in where New Orleans was headed relative to the others. The red line is when Katrina and the reforms happened, and then you can imagine two scenarios. This is just hypothetical. Either things got better and the arrow goes up and New Orleans is better than the comparison group, or things get worse and things go down. So this is just what I want you to take away from the next series of graphs. So here's the first one. This is the effect on science scores. So we had that nice flat trend beforehand, and science scores go up quite a lot. So this is the equivalent of going from where New Orleans was at the 22nd percentile nationally to about the 42nd percentile in this particular graph. Quite substantial. So that's moving the entire city from the 22nd to the 42nd, which is quite a large improvement. Social studies, same picture. Math, pretty much the same picture. Reading, pretty much the same picture. Graduation rates, high school graduation rates, not quite the same picture because it started to go up and then came back down a little bit, but all of those are positive. So the right side of that graph is still higher than the left side of that graph. So it's still positive, about 3 to 9 percentage point effect on high school graduation. College attendance is up by about 15 percentage points. Graduation is up, college graduation now is 3 to 5 percentage points. So this is across the whole city. So these are really surprising. I think I was surprised when I went down there to start studying this. I did not expect to see this because I don't think any district had ever improved that much that fast on so many different measures at once. So what do we take from this? I think that's the question. So here's the summary of the effects, most of which I've already given you. But let me make a couple other points here. So I think one is, whether this would work elsewhere, right? So I think the pro-charter folks would say, well, this is what charter schools can do. We should go do this everywhere. Well, maybe. I think there are lots of reasons actually to think that we wouldn't see the same effects in other places. One of those reasons is that New Orleans was extremely low performing to begin with. So I'm comparing New Orleans to this comparison group, but New Orleans was really low performing. It had, there was a lot of corruption, dysfunction. It was a very inefficient district. And there's actually no debate about that. So I've actually talked to union leaders who have said the same thing, that it was a mess and that some sort of an overhaul had to happen, and they might not have liked what they did, but everybody seems to agree that it was a big problem in the district. So it's easier to improve when you're at a very low level, right? Or another way to think about it is it's easier to beat weaker competition, right? So if you're comparing before and after, well, if the before was really terrible, then it's easier to beat that. Second reason is that after Katrina, there was so much interest in coming to New Orleans to help both rebuild the city and be part of this reform movement that it drew in educators from all over the country, right? So the schools had their pick of who they wanted in a way that most urban districts don't. So in most cities, the district struggles to attract teachers and to retain them. In New Orleans, they were able to pick who they wanted. And so that was certainly a huge advantage as well. So whether this would apply in other places, whether we're going to see the same effects, I'm actually skeptical that we will see the same effects elsewhere. I view New Orleans as the best case scenario for school reform. Now, it turns out to be a pretty high best case, right? So having all of those outcomes improve at the same time is really unusual, especially unusual when you think about the sequence of things. So if they were making the school more demanding to get test scores up, you might think, well, maybe the graduation rate will drop. Well, it didn't. The test scores went up and the high school graduation rate went up. Well, then you might think, well, if high school graduation rate goes up, maybe a smaller percentage of them will go to college because those students maybe aren't as well prepared as the students who would have gone to college anyway, but they still see a higher percentage going to college. So it's a very positive best case scenario. The question is, what's going to happen when everybody else does it? And I think we don't really have a great answer to that. But I do think there are lessons here for other places. And I view this whole thing as a debate about government and markets. And it's a very old debate. So let me say a little bit more about how things evolved in New Orleans to help explain why I think there are bigger lessons here. After a few years in New Orleans, it was basically an all-charter market. But the district, the recovery school district that was overseeing them, actually wasn't really overseeing them. It was basically a free-for-all. The schools could select the students they wanted to select. They could spend the money how they wanted to spend the money. They could push out students if they didn't think they fit or they were disruptive. They could pressure students into transferring. There are all sorts of things. And this was going on. Nobody questions that either, that there are a lot of bad things happening at that point. But then the state got more involved. They saw the problems. There were negative headlines. The state got more involved and said, okay, we're not going to let this go anymore. We're going to have a centralized enrollment system at the district level where everybody's going to submit their applications to the state. And then the state will actually do a lottery to see who gets into the different schools. We're going to put rules in place so they can't push students out. You can't transfer unless you go through the district. They had a centralized expulsion system that there had to be a specific kind of incident, only really extreme incidents that would allow a school to expel a student. So in other words, the government got more involved again, right? It went from being a free market to being something in between, right? So when we think about the spectrum here of what different kinds of school systems we could have traditional public schools only, which is where we were 25 years ago. We could have vouchers, right, which is still further out here where you really don't have much authority, just the government gives funds and the schools do what they want, and it's more of a free market approach. Or you can do something in the middle, and so the New Orleans system is more in the middle. It is a market-driven approach. Parents get to choose their schools, private operators, all nonprofits in New Orleans, by the way, are operating the schools, but the government's still heavily involved in regulating the market. And so in some ways, it's a lot like other debates that we have about government oversight over companies, right? That the government, or contracting. So the government can contract out for things, but the government needs to be watching over the contract to make sure that things are working. All right, so what does that tell us? It tells us that we can get potentially high outcomes if we have this mix, right? If we have the government involved in making sure that the system works, so it can be both a fair system and a high-performing one at the same time. One other result that's really important is those outcomes that I showed you earlier improved more, especially high school and graduation and college going, for disadvantaged kids. right? So it wasn't just that average outcomes were improving, that the achievement gap was also dropping in the district at the same time. So it shows that you can have a lot of these positive things happening. The prospect of charter schooling can be achieved under certain circumstances. Whether it can be achieved elsewhere, I'm not sure. So last place I want to go before I give you the answer on the ABC schools is what does this really mean then? So I think it means that to me, it tells me that we should detach ourselves a little bit from this notion of traditional public schools versus public schools and start thinking about what should the government do? What's the role of government, whether it's a district or whether it's somebody overseeing a charter school, some government agency overseeing a charter school. So I'll just tick through, I think, these 6 fundamental roles for government under any circumstances in a schooling system: accountability, transparency. So Carol made a lot of good points about the transparency of the finances, the transparency of the way charter school boards operate. Those are a big issue. And that's a problem in New Orleans too. So New Orleans is not perfect by any means in any of these. Engagement, so engaging the community and figuring out what kinds of schools do we want, right? That's the big philosophical question at issue here. What do we want schools to do for kids? Accessibility, making sure that everybody has access to schools, right? So making choice real for the families, so it's not schools choosing students, it's the students choosing schools. Coordination, enforcement, just enforcing the rules. If we could get the government to do that, that would be a huge improvement. So I think this is a better way to have the conversation. We get caught up in these labels. It's the end of traditional public education, or the end of public education, or we need to go to all charter schools because the public schools are failing. It's not a very productive conversation at that level. If we think about what the government really ought to be doing in schooling, then I think that's more helpful. One of the reasons why we have so many roles for government, if you're among those who thinks that a more free market approach would be better, is that the schooling market's a really unusual market. It's probably the most unusual market you can imagine. For example, geography, right? Kids have to get to school every day. Well, what other good or service can you think of that you have to get there every day and get back home? It significantly alters the way in which that market's going to operate in ways that demand a role for government. All right, so let me conclude with coming back to the 3 schools. I mentioned 3 at the beginning. It was a trick question, I confess. They're all charter schools in New Orleans. Yeah, so I didn't trick everybody. Yeah, those are all charter schools in New Orleans. And so some of those, it will surprise you that there's a charter school that is focusing on special education, or that's focusing on creativity, or it's focusing on creating a diverse population. But I think that's important, again, to focus on what the schools are actually doing. Again, I think the distinction between charter schools and traditional public schools just isn't very useful, and that we need to be focusing on making schools work, creating the right mix of schools for all kids, and that if we can just have the conversation focused on that everything will be a lot more productive, and hopefully in the Q&A we'll have more of that conversation.
Thank you, Douglas. Thank you. I don't know. I mean, if you're going to insist on that level of nuance, and it's not very useful to separate into 2 categories, there would be no, Fox and CNN would have nothing to do all day long. What would they have to do? But Carol, Douglas made the case that New Orleans was not perfect, and not necessarily applicable elsewhere, but that it showed a situation in which alarms went off, the charter schools were going in the wrong direction, and adjustments were made to turn things in a better direction. Taking that principle to what you really put together a litany of negative things about charter schools as they exist today, from many directions, from the point of view of, as you say, civil liberties, from the point of view of corruption, from the point of view of outcomes, from the point of view of erosion just of the culture in general. Is the lesson from New Orleans, okay, there are some problems, but they're all damn fixable?
Well, there was one important piece that Doug left out, which disappoints me because it was in his paper and he makes the case himself. Spending went up, and it didn't go up a small amount. It went up $1,358 per kid. Now that's a 13% increase in spending. A lot of it philanthropic money, I'm sure, but money matters in education, and somehow we've all been tricked into thinking that it doesn't. That 13% increase in spending was associated with a graduation rate increase between 3 and 9%. Well, there's a lot of other researchers that have talked about and researched what the impact of increased spending is. Carabo Jackson and his colleagues, for example, found just across schools in general that a 10% increase in spending raised graduation rates between 4 and 24%. So we know that money matters. So then the question is, what was it that really, I mean, that was a very, very complex reform. Can we say that it was charter schools that mattered? If they had done something very, very different, would they have had the same results if they also put in other resources? The other thing that differs a little bit in New Orleans is that there has been a change in demographic population. We all know the importance of poverty on educational outcomes.
Can I jump in for
Yeah.
a second, though? In a sense, I don't think you're answering my really fundamental question, which is, can't it all be fixed? Is it all fixable? And is the initial goal of charter schools to provide choice, to be a laboratory for innovation, to give access to people to better schools than they had before? Are those goals worth aiming for through charter schools? And can they be fixed to meet those goals?
I guess what I would ask is,
Or is the whole concept fundamentally flawed?
well, I think that it's very complex. First of all, the issue of school choice. I don't know if there are any major American cities, even with full public school systems like Omaha, Nebraska, that don't have school choice. I mean, my granddaughter had to get in a lottery to get into her neighborhood public school in New York City. So school choice, which also has pros and cons, it's not necessarily associated with charter schools. Then public schools can innovate too. I mean, the high school I ran, I thought was very innovative, and we had an alternative school that was very much like City High School, which is the charter school that started it all. Here's my biggest worry, John, with charter schools, is that I feel like it's work avoidance. We
It's what?
have this work avoidance. We have this narrative that public schools are broken, that it's teachers' fault. Some people will whisper that it's families' fault. So let's go ahead and we're going to do this whole other thing, when the real issues that we have are segregation, there's dire poverty, there's underfunding of our public school system, and all of those pieces together are the problem. And when we think that we can create all little schools to solve those problems, we're not dealing with the big issues that we have to fix for our public schools.
Okay, I want to go to questions. Does anybody have a question? So a microphone will be brought to you, and I'll start with the gentleman on the aisle. But while the mic is being brought to you, I just want to see, Douglas, would you like to respond to?
So
Yeah.
just quickly on the poverty point. So this is something we built into the analysis. When I first got down to New Orleans, that was the thing I was most worried about, that somehow the improvement in outcomes was just a change in the population, because we know this connection between poverty and achievement. But we did lots of analysis. We worked with the U.S. Census Bureau, and that's one thing we can rule out. It was not a change in the population that's driving the results.
Okay, sir.
Yes, if we could step back a moment, could either of you talk about what are the major deficiencies in the existing school system that we have today? And excluding the issue of funding, because I think that's somewhat of a bogus issue, the two things that jump out at me are lack of accountability or discipline and teacher accountability and qualifications.
You want to start, Karen?
Can't hear the question back.
Can you try it one more time, sir? Because if they didn't hear you, then you're not on the recording, so take another run at it. And if just, and if you could stand, please, that would be helpful too.
Okay.
You're getting a lot of coaching here.
Can you hear?
This is going to work
I'm
out.
up here.
No, you can,
Can you hear me now?
yes.
The question I had is if we could step back a moment and talk about what you think are the major deficiencies in the public school system today. The two things that jump out at me are lack of accountability for teachers, lack of discipline. The issue that I don't
Lack of discipline of students.
of students. The one issue I don't like to hear is the idea that, oh, if we only had more funding or if we didn't have poverty. I want to deal with really what you think are the essential reasons why Many people think our school systems are failing.
What you're really asking is, are the two factors you're talking about serious factors in why the schools are performing in some places in disappointing ways? Carol, I'll let you take that first.
Sure, we may not like to hear them, but poverty matters. It's true, especially when it's concentrated poverty.
But,
And there were-
but to his point, what about teacher accountability
teacher-
and what about discipline?
Listen, I ran a high school for 15 years. It had a strong union. I will tell you that the teachers were accountable. They felt intrinsically motivated to do the job. They were accountable to me, and they were accountable to the community. And if there was a teacher that wasn't performing, I found a way either to get them to improve or to coach them out of the profession. So this myth that teachers are not accountable, I don't think it's true.
That's not true in New York City.
My husband was a teacher in New York City, and he felt that it was true.
Douglas, do you want to take the discipline? But only once. Douglas, do you
And my opinion doesn't matter.
you can only be unique once. Douglas, do you want to
Yeah,
take the discipline side of the question? So we've already discussed funding. That's why I think you were introducing this element. These other two factors, are they again, I don't know if it's researchable, but whether discipline practices have anything to do with outcomes.
I think they probably do, although it's more the discipline part is more complicated than it seems. It sort of cuts both ways, and there's debate about this now. If you become more strict and you suspend students, then those students are out of school. It's probably better for the learning environment, at least in the short term, because it's less disruptive. But then if you suspend them, then it creates problems for those kids down the road. And so lots of schools are experimenting with approaches like restorative justice, where they're trying to keep the kids in the school, but also improve the learning environment.
And do charter schools have more leeway in setting up their own systems of discipline?
Yes, they have more leeway in pretty much everything, and they do tend to be more strict in discipline and more likely to suspend. And that's controversial because on the one hand, there are good reasons why you might want to be more strict. On the other hand, it makes it easy for the schools then to select students, because if they say, well, this is a student who's disruptive or low performing, I can just expel them and get rid of them. And the traditional public schools.
So you're saying
conservative.
select through expulsion rather than
Right.
because you still
Right.
can't. The charter schools cannot choose their students.
Well, they can. That's the problem. I mean, one of the big problems with charter schools, and especially in an unregulated setting, is the charter schools can select their own students. And one of the ways they can select them is sort of by deselecting them. They come in and they're disruptive or
But it's an
low
unofficial selection. It's
Correct.
backhanded. Okay.
Yep.
Another question. Oh, I'm told we're out of time. One more question. Far in the back, yeah. This is going to be a great question because it's our last one. But wait for the mic. Thanks, please.
I need a microphone. I live in Midland, Michigan. And my general question is, America believes in competition. Why isn't there room for both? Build the public schools, build the charter schools. Anecdotally, my son-in-law's brother taught in Teach for America in the worst part of Manhattan, 7th and 8th grade. And he brought all the scores up because he said, you can do it, and I will come in early and late to make you sure I see that you do it by
Okay.
working with you. The teacher said to him, do not do this. You're embarrassing us. Cut it back. So not every teacher is in your kind of school.
Okay. I'm going to. I have 7 minutes on the clock here. That's
But I
wrong.
really don't understand why we are at war
Yeah.
when all of it can work well. Mind you, there are some that are crooks and some that are failing, and not everything is applicable.
I'd like to take your question as a comment, because you really laid down a line, but I wanted to see if we could go to and I think that I think especially Carol has explored that issue of one against the other. So I'd like to go to one more question in the front row here, please.
My daughter teaches. I'm sorry. My daughter teaches in a charter school in New Orleans. She was in the Renew schools and just had it closed, but because the middle school in there was failing. Do you have that kind of agility in between? I noticed that because there was a problem in the school, they were able to close it. I mean, they gave it like a year or two, and then found out when they couldn't turn it around, they closed it.
And does your daughter consider that a justified outcome?
Well, she was upset because of she was the lower school,
Yeah.
and the lower school was doing great.
Right.
So, but the middle school was not.
And
But she's very happy where she's moved now, though.
Okay, let me take that question then.
So short answer is yes.
Douglas.
Actually, one of the biggest changes I didn't have time to talk about was that they really are closing low-performing schools. So if a school is an F school for several years in a row, then they close it. And they've done that pretty mechanically, so that something like 35 or 40 schools in a city that only has about 80 schools have been shut down for performance since the reform started. And that's probably the main driver behind the measurable improvement in the city based on our analysis.
I apologize that we're out of time. These great folks are going to be around, and so are you. So bump into each other and ask further questions. I really appreciate the energy here, and thank you for all of you.
Thank you.